On Stockton Street in Princeton is an old white house set back from the road. Its name is Morven. For almost 200 years, it was home to generations of Stocktons, key figures in 18th and 19th century America. In the 20th century, changing fortunes led the family to lease it out. The tenant was another historic figure, the powerful and rich industrialist Robert Wood Johnson. Later still, Morven became the official governor's mansion for the state of New Jersey. All of this history is part of its new identity as Morven Museum and Garden. We first visited in 2002 during renovations.
In the course of all our research and archaeological excavation and so forth, we have found out that Morven is too complicated to be a single period house museum. That in fact we've had 250 years of very lively occupation, all kinds of modifications made by the various residents, and we really can't interpret the house to any single period.
Morven's history starts before the house was even built.
The original deed for Morven, which was obtained from William Penn in 1701, contained over 5,000 acres. The first person to live here was Richard Stockton, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
The young attorney built the house in 1758 on part of the vast tract his grandfather had acquired. He brought to it his young wife, the poet Annis Boudinot. It was Annis who named the house Morven.
Annis Stockton is one of America's earliest published female poets. She was an early advocate for women's rights, not in the sense that we think of them today, but in an 18th century sense of the word. She felt that women should provide the moral foundation for the new nation.
And she memorialized the country's new heroes, like her friend General Washington, in epic verse. Portraits of Richard and Annis preside at Morven, but the house they lived in was much changed in the years that followed. Finding out when and how was the first job for the architectural firm charged with the restoration.
If you look closely over here, you can see this was the actual level of the window in the 18th century, and in the 19th century, when this floor level was raised, when the second floor level was raised, and when the roof was raised, they also moved up the windows. You can actually also see, you can just see a shadow of it on the outside as well. Here you can see some of the layering of the plaster work, 18th century plaster, and then here in the 1950s renovations, they just put new plaster over it. You can see the metal lath and the different kind of plaster right on top of it.
Governor Walter Edge bought Morven from the Stocktons, then gave it to the state of New Jersey to become either a museum or a governor's mansion, which it became. In 1957, Governor and Mrs. Minor were the first official residents, followed by Governor Hughes and his 10 children.
Mrs. Betty Hughes, wife of the governor, keeps constantly on the go, determined that neither family nor Morven shall suffer. The gleaning kitchen must be ever ready for affairs varying from 6 people to 60. And although Mrs. Devi Chafee, Mrs. Hughes' secretary, checks details, the responsibility rests with the governor's lady.
Well, this is a door that now goes out to the West Wing porch, and the West Wing porch is where that 1950s kitchen was. That's where the 1950s kitchen addition was done. It was a very sleek and modern, sort of the highest end 1950s kitchen. By the time we got here, it was obviously very run down and looked very dated. So when we started work here, we decided that that 1950s kind of inappropriate addition should come down, and we would reconstruct the 19th century porch. And so this door is in the original location, and we found, you could see very clearly in the brickwork where the door was. That kitchen stayed for the entire time that the house was used by the governor, so all the way until the early 1980s.
After the Hugheses came the Cahills, and then Brendan Byrne, the last governor to live at Morven.
Well, of course, we moved in with 6 kids, and you know, all of a sudden we preempted the house. It was a fun house. It was also a house where you didn't have much privacy. I mean, I would come down in the morning and there'd be somebody there often. There was no place to hide.
Well, I was running for governor. It was still a governor's mansion. And I'd go in there for all sorts of parties and receptions, and always had a good time. But everybody knew it wasn't quite right for the kind of big party that governors want to hold. Great house for children, great house to grow up in, but not great for parties. All the parties had to be in a tent out in the back. The decision was made that Drumthwacket was going to become the governor's mansion, and Morven was going to become a historic site. Early on, we started doing some digging, and what came up were some very historic things, some pottery and some plates, really from Revolutionary times and before, artifacts, and I guess the silverware of the time, and it was fun because children would come, and we had a lot of people from school, and they'd participate, so that they'd sift the sand and sift the earth, and they'd get very excited. They'd find something that was historic.
This piece of trim, there's like picture frame materials under the windows.
Making Morven into a museum meant detective work to uncover the past. It also meant bringing the old house up to 21st century code.
We had long discussions, did a lot of research about what made the most sense for lighting, what was going to be the most flexible lighting, for instance, what was going to be the best lighting system so we could light different kinds of exhibits, and at the same time where we could cut the fewest number of holes into the structure, into the plaster, and all of that stuff.
Restoration is part history, part interpretation. Part of Morven's challenge is that so many colorful characters lived here, including Helen Hamilton Shields Stockton, the last of the Stocktons to live at Morven.
When she married into the Stockton family, she decided to renovate the house, improve it, and she decided that it didn't live up to what she thought the history of the family was, and she added moldings, very fancy wallpapers, got fancy furniture. Where the mantelpieces weren't fancy enough, she went out and bought ones and pretended that they were originally from the house. One of the reasons why the house is famous is because she added to the myth of Morven.
There was a colonial revival going on, and Helen played it up. Wigs and gowns were donned for a party in 1901. There was even a home movie made featuring the family playing the parts of their own ancestors. This fashion for the past extended even to Morven's garden, where Helen may have left her greatest imprint.
This is what we call our colonial revival garden. A lot of research has gone into the creation of this. Archaeology as well. We were looking for the footprint of the garden that Annis Boudinot had here in the 18th century, and we have found some remnants of a garden walk. Finally, after lots of soul searching, though, we decided to recreate the garden that we knew the most about, which instead of a colonial garden is a colonial revival garden. And this garden was installed by Helen Hamilton Shields Stockton, and she created a very typical colonial garden where we have rows of boxwood, peonies, phlox, iris, and always the sort of conical profile of the shrubbery.
That was 2002. 3 years later, we visited the garden in early summer to see how the work was going.
The way we garden today is not the way that people gardened before. They had a lot of different ideas about what looks good in the garden. For example, we have daylily beds that are just daylilies, and today that would be considered boring, and nobody would want just daylilies. And it is a struggle to decide, do we plant the old-fashioned cultivars that might be a little more disease prone, or do we plant newer ones that look like the old ones but are a little bit healthier? We have a group of regular garden volunteers that come here every Thursday morning. They like Morven and they love to garden, so perfect combination for them. And we also work with the Isles program in Trenton. We have a group of interns that come out here for 6 weeks. They're here 3 days a week. They work with us and usually get a big project done and then some other side projects.
Inside, renovations are over and Morven Museum is open to the public.
We're always very aware of the fact that we are an 18th century house, and our exhibits work around that and highlight it.
In the dining room, the table is set with china and silver that belonged not to Richard and Annis, but to Annis's brother and Richard's sister.
Annis Boudinot married Richard Stockton's sister Hannah, and then Richard Stockton married Annis Boudinot's sister Annis.
No doubt they dined together often. Morven is full of beautiful things, but it's also full of funny, moving, and important stories that are intimately tied to New Jersey.
One of my great memories is walking out of the front door of Morven to go down to Atlantic City to sign the bill legalizing casino gambling in Atlantic City. And as I walked out that door, I said to myself, my God, Richard Stockton walked out the same door to sign the Declaration of Independence, and I'm walking out to sign a gambling bill. And I'm sort of ashamed of myself, but the history is there, and I think it's something you appreciate.
And so much happened at Morven. You know, this was a signer. He was not the most popular man in town because he signed a declaration, and when the British came along, he changed and went the other way. But he was a very important character. Modern times, Fidel Castro stopped by, and Jimmy Carter, and it's a very, very historic home. And if you care about history, and you have a home like Morven, and you preserve it, you open it up, you let your children and your grandchildren see it, because that's important.